Hello everyone, my name is Natalie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm sharing with y'all some books I've been really enjoying this year but haven't really gotten the opportunity to talk about with my crazy semester schedule and not being able to film very much. I filmed, 2 videos this whole semester. The first book I want to talk about is Poison Study by Maria V. Snyder. This is the first book in a young adult fantasy series about a girl named Yelena. She is rescued from execution when she is offered to train as a food taster for the ruler of Ixia, the kingdom that she lives in. However, to prevent her from escaping, she is given a poison and she has to return to her mentor Valak every day in order to get an antidote and stay alive. She gets caught up in a political conspiracy that could change the entire kingdom while also having to deal with her personal problems and trying to hide her growing magical abilities in a kingdom where magic has been banned. I gave Poison Study 4 out of 5 stars and I kind of loved it, especially Yelena. She goes through a lot of character development. You see her become more clever and strategic, more confident, and she has to face a lot of her fears over the course of the book. I also loved Valak and pretty much all of the side characters. The romance subplot I was not expecting in terms of the love interest, but I surprisingly kind of liked it. It is in no means insta-love. It is pretty slow burn for the first half or so of the book, and then it picks up more in the second half. Really, I just loved all of the relationships in this book. The friendships are just so integral to Yelena's character growth, and it's just really beautiful. Something Snyder does amazingly well is her realistic portrayal of sexual violence against women, and PTSD. Yelena grew up in this orphanage where the owner and his son were very abusive, to the point that she actually ended up murdering his son, and that's how she ended up in prison and sentenced to death. The book picks up after this incident and you learn quickly what happened and why she's in the prison. So it's not spoilery or anything, but Yelena does have flashbacks about her experience at the orphanage throughout the book, and sometimes they can get a bit graphic. I would certainly call them distressing scenes and potentially triggering, so just keep that in mind when you're considering reading Poison Study. The reason why I did not give it a 5 out of 5 stars as much as I enjoyed it is the main plot dragged too much for my liking. So the main plot is the whole political conspiracy, and Yelena and Valak are trying to figure out what's going on, what's going to happen next, who's behind it, and how they can prevent everything from going wrong. And it just developed too slowly. It took Yelena and Valak too long to figure some of the stuff out. Some of the clues I figured out before they did, and they're supposed to be super smart. So I was just, reading, waiting for them to catch up. It's still a compelling book. Even though some parts were slow or predictable, I was never bored. Considering it's the first book in a series, it impressed me in a lot of ways. First book has really impressed me, and I might continue the series. The second book I want to mention is the Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. So Maggie Stiefvater is probably most famous for the Raven Cycle. So many people talk about those books, especially here on BookTube, and I barely hear anyone talk about the Scorpio Races. It's just so underrated, but it's easily one of my favorite books of all time. I check it out from the library so often, I just really need to get my own copy at this point. And Scorpio Races is kind of a magical realism romance book, and it's inspired by Celtic mythology. It does overall take place in our world technically, but the island of Thisbe that it takes place on is made up. Every November, these horses called the Kapelushka emerge from the sea, and every November, men on the island try to capture one of these horses and race it on the beach in the annual Scorpio Races. It's not only dangerous, but deadly, because the horses are not normal horses. They are creatures of legend, and they are also flesh-eating. The book follows 2 main characters, Puck Connolly and Sean Kendrick. Puck and her brothers are struggling to survive after their parents are killed in a Kapelushka attack. Against pretty much everyone else's advice, Puck enters the races, hoping the prize money will help them pay off all their bills and debts and maybe even keep her family together. She is also the first female to ever enter the races, and she experiences a lot of opposition from the townspeople because of that. Sean Kendrick works as a trainer at one of the biggest and best stables on the island, and when it's time for the races, he represents the farm and is considered one of the best jockeys on the island. And he's kind of the reigning champion at this point. But another prize win isn't what he wants. What he wants is a horse of his own, or rather a kapelushka of his own, specifically Core, the bright red stallion that he always rides in the races, and he is pretty much raised. So this book follows Sean and Puck leading up to the races. Like I said before, I love this book. It's easily one of my favorite books of all time. While I do think more people should read the Scorpio Races, it's not a book that's going to appeal to everyone. I still suggest picking it up, checking it out, reading a little bit of it and see if it's for you. But it's not one of those books that's super action-packed with a swiftly moving plot and tons of twists and turns. It's more of a quiet, atmospheric kind of book. It's very much focused on the characters and their development and relationship. And it's not just a love story between two people either. It's also the love story between a person and their homeland, between people and animals, and it's just so beautiful and moving. So it explores complex family dynamics, small town dynamics, and sexism. So I love the characters, I love the settings, just love everything about this book. And it just really sticks with me every time I read it. It has this almost haunting quality to it. So all that being said, go read it. The next book I want to talk about is A Curse to Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kimmerer. I heard a lot about this book before I read it. It got a lot of hype. It was one of my most anticipated releases of this year. I'd read Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kimmerer earlier this year and loved it, wanted to read more of her contemporaries. So what caught my attention with this book was the fact that it's a fantasy. I wanted to see how well she handled other genres. A Curse to Dark and Lonely is about Prince Ren, who is cursed to repeat the autumn of his 18th year until a girl falls in love with him and the bloodthirsty monster he turns into. It's also about a girl named Harper trying to keep her family together and about hope. I gave this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. I loved Harper so much. She is tenacious and determined and compassionate, and she just has this really beautiful character arc as you see her grow in her self-confidence, navigating the strange realm of Emberfell, learning to be vulnerable and to look past first impressions, all while becoming embroiled in the political turmoil of Emberfell and its surrounding kingdoms. Harper also has cerebral palsy. I have not read or heard of very many books with this kind of representation, and it seemed very refreshing to have it featured in a fantasy series. I'm the kind of person that always reads the author's notes, and in this author's note, Kimmerer said that she strove to create a girl who was strong, resilient, and capable. Not in spite of any physical challenges she may face, but in addition to them. She did a lot of research on cerebral palsy, including interviewing people who have it. In-depth research like that is something I always appreciate. In the end, I do think she was successful in doing what she was trying to do, and that was create a realistic character. I also really loved how Bridget Kimmerer retold and reshaped the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale, because it's one thing to fall in love with a monster like you see in the original tale. It's another thing to fall in love and then have to witness the horrific transformation into the monster. I'm really excited about the sequel. There was this huge plot twist cliffhangery thing at the end of this book, so I'm interested in seeing how that's going to affect the rest of the story, what she's gonna do, what's gonna happen to all the characters. 2019 has just been a year of finding series I like and want to continue. I've not had much luck actually continuing them, but they're there. I've accomplished something that I've had trouble with in the past. The fourth book is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars, and it is definitely one of the top contenders for best book I've read this year. My Cousin Rachel is a historical fiction kind of thriller. It's a gothic. Daphne du Maurier wrote a lot of gothic fiction, which I love, and it takes place in England, I think in the late 1800s. My Cousin Rachel is about this young man named Philip who's been raised by his older cousin Ambrose. They're very much secluded. He isn't around other people very much, especially when it comes to other people his age, or more specifically, girls his age. And it doesn't help that his cousin is a self-professed woman hater. Those are his words. Ambrose goes to Italy one winter and he doesn't come back. He falls in love with a woman named Rachel, who's distantly related to them by marriage or something, and he stays there. Philip gets letters from him that become increasingly erratic and paranoid, and then they just stop. And Philip learns that his cousin has died. Everyone else is telling him that it was a brain tumor. It was a brain tumor. It runs in the family. Philip suspects that Rachel poisoned and killed him. The story gets even more complicated when Rachel shows up to his house because Ambrose did not leave her anything in his will. It all went to Philip, and it's socially expected for him to take care of his cousin's widow. And so it's all about their relationship, him trying to figure out if she's a killer, and then he also just becomes obsessed with her and eventually kind of sort of falls in love with her himself. It's a wild ride. And it just turns very dangerous very quickly. This book is just so good. I'm sorry, my cat's really distracting. You want to say hi? This is Ziva. She doesn't like being held. And she likes to get pets when I'm filming. This book is just so good. It had me hooked from the start. Never let up. I will say it's one of those books that took me longer to read, but for good reason. It's one of those books that you kind of have to read at a slower pace, just with the rhythm and cadence and how it's actually written. Philip's not exactly a likable character. He's definitely adopted some of Ambrose's sexist views. He even mocks and dismisses his only female friend, who's a childhood friend. He derides other women. He's just not a great fellow, you know? He's also very naive and judgmental and, well, obsessive. And the relationship ends up very controlling and not healthy in the least. So yeah, My Cousin Rachel explores a lot of gender roles, social expectations and pressures, things like that. The ending is also ambiguous, pretty debated. It's really good, and it makes you look at the book in a different way, especially at the beginning. I reread the first few chapters after reading the ending, and it completely changed how I looked at the book. The final book I want to talk to you about is The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. This is a book I had to read for one of my classes this semester. It's also pretty new. I think it came out earlier this year. The Nickel Boys is set in Florida in the late 1960s at the height of the civil rights movement. It follows two African-American boys. Turner and Elwood are at what's essentially a juvenile reform center called Nickel School for Boys. Everyone thinks it's this amazing school for troubled youth, but really they're trying to cover up decades and decades of horrible abuse. The book follows their experience at Nickel, their friendship, and most importantly, the racial dynamics of the time and their personal relationship to the civil rights movement. I gave it a 4.5 to a high 4 out of 5 stars. Turner and Elwood are very different. Turner is very hopeful about change and strongly believes in the power of the civil rights movement. He pretty much idolizes Martin Luther King Jr., and he actually ends up getting an opportunity to go to a local college that is allowing Black students in. On the first day of college, he hitches a ride, and it turns out that the car is stolen. Even though he didn't know that when he got in the car, he's still charged and he is sent to this reform school. Howard has an increasingly difficult time dealing with the conditions at the school because he's always been gung-ho about doing the right thing, standing up for what you believe in, and not backing down when you see something wrong that's happening. And it gets him in a lot of trouble. He's also just really naive in general, and that's an aspect of the character that really develops and changes over the course of the book because of what's happening at Nickel. You have Turner, who is the complete opposite. It's not his first time at Nickel. He's been there for a few years. He's very bitter and jaded, and his perspective is basically, it is what it is. The world is a horrible place, and nothing about that is going to change. People are gaining rights, but it's still not equal. It doesn't affect everyone in the same way. How much of a difference is it actually making? And so it's this really interesting dynamic between the two of them. Like I said before, this book deals with abuse. Severe verbal, emotional, and physical abuse. They actually have this shed called the White House where they take students to get whipped when they're punished. And those scenes in particular are fairly graphic. There is sexual abuse in this book, but it's more alluded to in like passing statements. For example, there's just one part where it said some of the supervisors would watch the boys in the community shower and like see which ones they liked and which ones they wanted to take on a date. They referred to them as their boyfriends, or they were going to take them to Lover's Lane, things like that. It's very coded and implied, and from what I can tell, neither of the main characters experience this sexual abuse, but kind of pick up on, but you definitely pick up on it affecting some of the side characters. This is definitely an important book to read, and it's a good book, albeit one that's sometimes difficult to get through. What makes it even more impactful and terrifying, honestly, is that it's based on true events. The Nickel School is based off of a real reform school in Marianna, Florida, called the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys. It was operating from 1900 to 2011, and it did start as a good thing, but for most of the time it was open, they were covering up abuse. Investigations started after they failed a state inspection in 2009, and they ended up finding, they had like a normal cemetery on school grounds, because they would have students who like got sick, or there was a fire in one of the buildings and people died from that. So more natural, less suspect causes. While investigating, they found dozens and dozens of unmarked graves, and I think they are still finding some of them. They have found 82 bodies in these unmarked graves, but it's suspected that there's over 100 on the campus. And with these unmarked graves, they would be for the boys who tried to escape and were caught, and the administration would torture and kill them and bury them in these unmarked graves, and they would just say, oh, like they ran away and we couldn't find them or something, and it's presumed that if you don't find them, they died of starvation or exposure or being attacked by a wild animal in the woods or something. So there were a lot of families that were broken up because of this. People who didn't know what happened to their sons or their brothers or their cousins. And Colson Whitehead, his whole reason for writing this story was to raise awareness, to expose the truth and maybe even help people who were trapped in a similar, who were trapped in similar circumstances. Because if one school went undetected for over a century, then there could be hundreds of other schools doing the same thing and we don't even know about it. We don't know what's happening to these kids. It makes reading the book even more heartbreaking and impactful because you know these things aren't just realistic like they could happen, they did happen. And it just adds another layer of emotion and difficulty in reading this book. Highly recommend this book, but again, keep in mind the trigger warnings and the abuse. You obviously know how you react to certain things and books. I'm putting that information out there for you to decide for yourself. That is all for today. I hope you found some books that interest you and you may want to add to your TBR. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel, and click the notification bell. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Keep reading, and I'll see you next time here on The Mighty Quill.